he killed children. The exact number of his victims has not been determined to this day. He has always desired to harm others and cause others to suffer. Albert Fish, the future maniac and cannibal, was born in Washington in 1870. At that time, his father, Randall Fish, who was a fertilizer salesman, was 75 years old. He was 43 years older than Albert's mother. The maniac had 2 brothers and a sister, but he was the youngest among them. Later, psychiatrists and researchers argued that all members of the Fish family were suffering from various mental illnesses. Most likely, when making diagnoses in absentia, scientists attempted to find the most plausible, from their perspective, explanation for what transforms an ordinary person into a bloodthirsty monster. In any case, no reliable evidence of Fish's mental disorders has ever been presented. At birth, the future individual received the name Hamilton. He was 5 years old when his father, Randall Fish, died of a heart attack on the street. The family did not have any significant savings, and Hamilton's mother was forced to place him in a shelter. During his time in the shelter, Hamilton received a nickname that was consistent with his name, and he was unable to fully detach from it for a long period of time. This led to his dislike of the name given at birth. While still in the shelter, he discovered that he derived pleasure from pain. In those days, some shelters in the United States practiced physical punishment, such as spanking, during which Hamilton experienced an unusual reaction. This reaction, which occurred in the form of an erection, served as a further incentive for others to bully him. 4 years later, in 1879, Hamilton's mother secured a government position and was able to take her son out of the shelter. However, the experience in the institution had a lasting impact on Hamilton and shaped his future. He was only 12 years old when he entered a same-sex romantic relationship with another young man who delivered telegrams. At around the same time, the individual known as Fish began to frequent public baths, where they could freely observe other men in a state of undress. They were particularly drawn to boys between the ages of 7 and 12. In 1890, the individual moved to New York City. Shortly after this move, they changed their name from Hamilton, which they disliked, to Albert. He later stated that he had moved to become a prostitute. It is unknown whether he fulfilled his plans. However, it can be assumed that after the move, he began to regularly engage young boys in sexual activities. The man chose his victims from street children, who were numerous on the streets of New York at the time. They did not report the incidents to the police, so the police were not aware of Fish's activities. However, his mother suspected something and decided to marry him urgently. In 1898, Albert married a 19-year-old woman chosen by his mother. They had 6 children together, 4 sons and 2 daughters, but he continued to engage in child exploitation. In 1903, Fish was arrested for stealing from a warehouse where he worked part-time as a loader or deckmaker. He received a 2-year prison sentence and was sent to the notorious Sing 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 prison. While in prison, Albert was popular among other inmates. In those times, men with unusual preferences still tended to conceal their activities. Therefore, hardened prisoners who had not seen women for decades had to take advantage of weaker inmates. And there is no need to force them. Albert was always in favor of this. After being released from prison in 1905, Fish remained quiet for a while. Or perhaps he did not quiet down. There was no widespread information technology, and therefore no one became aware of some crimes. The first homicide that Fish was charged with occurred in 1910. The victim was Thomas Baden from Delaware, aged 10. The following massacre took place 9 years later. According to police, Fish took the life of a mentally disabled boy in Virginia using a knife. The monster committed another crime 5 years after that. On July 14, 1924, 8-year-old Francis McDonnell went missing. The boy's friends reported that he had left with an older, thin man with gray hair and a mustache. The police initiated a search for the man, who was known as Gray Man due to the color of his coat, which the police also noted. However, at the time, the police lacked experience in investigating unmotivated cases, and the investigation proved fruitless. On February 11, 1927, 4-year-old Billy Gaffney went missing. A 3-year-old boy, also named Billy, who was a friend of Gaffney's, witnessed the event. According to the witness, while they were playing near their house, a stranger approached them. The witness described the man as not scary. but rather fascinating. The boy even allowed the man to touch his gray mustache. Today's police would undoubtedly cling to this description and connect it to the case, but the experience of police officers at the time may have affected their ability to do so. The man committed the most notorious kidnapping and murder in June of 1928, when 18-year-old Edward Butts placed an advertisement in the newspaper seeking work in a rural area. He indicated his address, which was where 58-year-old Fisher arrived. It is possible that Fisher intended to kidnap Edward's younger sister, Grace, but his plans changed after spending time with the family. He promised to hire Edward and left after several hours. He returned, as promised, a couple of days later, instructed Edward to pack his belongings, and he would pick him up later. Meanwhile, Edward would be preparing. Fish introduced himself as Frank Howard, a farmer, and convinced Grace's parents to allow her to accompany him on a holiday, he said, at his niece's, who lived not far away, for her birthday. The unscrupulous individuals allowed the girl to go and never saw her again. 2 years after Grace's disappearance, police arrested Charles Edward Pope. His wife informed the police that he was responsible for kidnapping the girl. Pope was imprisoned for 4 months, but his guilt was not proven in court. However, it turned out that he intended to divorce his wife and had already moved out of their shared residence. 6.5 years after Grace vanished in November 1934, Delia, her mother, received an anonymous letter from the perpetrator. This letter became one of the most infamous messages from criminals, as the author disclosed shocking details about the case. In the letter, the individual wrote, "Dear Mrs. Bath. In 1894, a friend of mine served as a sailor on a ship under Captain John Davis' command. They sailed from San Francisco to Hong Kong, China. Upon arrival, my friend and 2 other crew members went ashore to drink. They were intoxicated. When they returned, the boat had already departed. At that time, there was a famine in China, and meat of any type cost between $1 and $3 per pound. As the poor suffered most, all children under the age of 12 were sold as food in order to save older family members from starvation. Boys and girls under 14 were not safe on the streets. One could walk into any store and request a steak, and the meat would be prepared for them. If one only desired a cut of meat, they would be provided with a piece of a child's body. The buttocks of a child are the most flavorful part of their body and were sold at the highest prices. A friend who had been there developed a taste for human flesh, and upon returning to New York captured boys aged 7 and 11 years. He kept them tied up in his remote residence and spanked them several times a day to make the meat more palatable. He first killed the 11-year-old boy as he was larger and had more flesh. The younger boy followed the same path. Fish was a pathological liar, as everyone believed that someone was pulling a prank on them. However, the letter was delivered to the police and came into the hands of Chief Investigator William King. The police officer did not think it was a joke and noticed that the envelope was sealed in an official envelope bearing the logo of the New York Teamsters Private Benevolent Association. These envelopes are not mass-produced, but rather in small batches. King ordered a comprehensive investigation into all employees of these organizations regarding the unauthorized use of envelopes. The door attendant admitted to taking several envelopes for personal use, but did not have time to utilize them all and left some behind in a room he recently vacated. The owner of that room reported that the room was then rented by an elderly gentleman with a gray mustache who received payments from his son. Having recently moved out, he had not received the latest transfer and needed to come for it. The king decided to personally meet with the suspicious individual. At that time, there were no specialized forces available, and police officers sometimes went alone to apprehend criminals, as the king did. Albert Fish, upon the investigator's introduction and offer to accompany him, attacked the king with 2 straight razors, but the police officers subdued the individual and took him to headquarters. There, the perpetrator immediately admitted to having taken Grace's life, and her mother and brother identified him. However, the police decided to investigate Fish for other cases of disappearance. His photograph was published in the newspapers, and soon, a trolley bus conductor contacted the police, who identified Fish as the man who was traveling in a vehicle with a young boy on 11 February 1927. The young boy remembered the incident because he was without a jacket, crying and constantly calling for his mother. This was the day when Bill Gaffney went missing, whose body has never been found. The mother of the young boy turned directly to the suspect and asked him about her son, and Fish revealed everything that had happened, including how he had mocked him and eaten him over a period of 4 days. Following the letter from the mother of Grace, most psychologists began to conclude that Albert Fish was insane and could not stand trial. Apparently, this was exactly the verdict that the individual who described his actions was seeking. The defendant also claimed that they deeply believed in a higher power, and even though they ate their victims' flesh and drank their blood, they believed they were performing a ritual. Despite psychiatrists' inclination to consider the defendant's actions to be those of a mentally ill person, the defendant still appeared before a jury. It is possible that this was due to political considerations. Regardless, on March 11, 1935, a trial began to determine the defendant's involvement in the deaths of 3 individuals. Police accused the defendant of 15 counts, and the defendant confessed to 498 counts. The trial concluded 10 days later with a death sentence. After hearing the defendant, the individual exclaimed that it would be a relief to die in the electric chair, and that it would be the most pleasurable experience they had not yet encountered. The individual was indeed a masochist, and they did not exaggerate when they stated that they enjoyed pain. On January 16, 1936, Albert Fish, while chained to the electric chair at the familiar Sing Sing prison, failed to receive an immediate electric shock. The switch had to be activated twice before a doctor declared him dead. This was due to the fact that Fish had previously inserted several dozen needles into his body, 27 of which were found in his groin. These metal objects prevented the normal passage of the electric current, but they also caused unbearable pain for Fish. It appears that the maniac derived some form of pleasure from this double execution process.